We hear paranormal, spooky, mysterious stories all the time. But 9 times out of 10, even though we want to believe, we remain skeptical. Still questioning, still unsure, always suspicious. We pick apart every detail, trying to debunk every little piece of the puzzle we can. What about the storyteller? They can't be credible. They must be a wacko or an insane person. They can't be telling the truth. Or can they? Sometimes it is hard to trust the legitimacy of a story's original source. We have almost been trained to question everyone. They could be a whistleblower on a larger scale or just a plain fabricator on a smaller scale. When we can't find any other thing to invalidate a story, we end up at the same place every time. Credibility. Where did the witness come from? Have they ever been in trouble? What do they do for a living? What do they do for a living? I don't think it is like this in all parts of the world, but where I'm from, the US, your occupation, or whatever it is you do for a living, is for some strange reason the thing that makes you who you are here. Now, that may be a tiny bit exaggerated, but honestly, it's a big part of who you are in the US around here. The better your job, the more credible a person you are. If you are a gas station attendant or a waitress, any less prominent job, if you work at McDonald's, don't get me wrong, in my opinion, these people are the backbone of our civilization. So shout out to the people that work the jobs that nobody else wants to work. But I mean, here in America, they act like, if you're a homeless man told you a crazy tale, then compared to a CEO, who are you going to believe? So, as unfortunate as it may be, if you are a Marine or a doctor or a police officer, your word is often taken to be true and honest. So, how do you feel about that? Do you tend to believe a story if it's told by a cop? Today, I'm going to share 3 stories with you that are said to be true reports of the paranormal told by law enforcement officials. So whether or not you believed in the paranormal before, you may no longer be a skeptic after hearing the shocking accounts of terrifying paranormal activity witnessed by police officers and law enforcement. Grab a friend, you aren't scared all by yourself, and get ready for 3 unnerving tales of disturbing paranormal activity. Let's jump right into it. Building sites are often featured in ghost stories, since when new ground is broken, old things better left undisturbed can sometimes appear to haunt those involved. They're not always ghosts though. Often they can be something stranger. That's where this next story starts. One summer's night in the late 90s at a housing estate at the edge of town that was under construction, but also a series of completed model homes for potential buyers to view. So those are the empty houses that are built fully and not really houses that people live in. Model homes, right? During the day, the model homes' lights and appliances were on to make the house as welcoming and homely as possible. One night in question, a security guard was patrolling all the properties and switching everything off, locking the homes down and then heading home for the night. The estates had been having issues with thieves, and the construction company requested a patrol pass by during the night. The officers assigned to the patrol were passing by the estate around 1 a.m. The place was locked down for a while, and the officers were expecting it to be dark until he noticed all the lights were on in the model homes. So one officer put a call into dispatch, and they put him in touch with the security guard, who assumed the officer had turned everything off when he left earlier that evening. The officer, thinking it was probably some pranksters, but needing assurance for sure, asked the guard to come out to the site to meet him with the keys. While the officer was waiting, he thought he saw people in the upper windows of at least one of the houses watching him. But when he did turn, the people were gone. This put him on guard, but without any concrete sightings, it could have just been shadows from passing cars. The guard showed up after a little while, and they began to patrol the site together, checking each of the buildings and locking them down properly. There were 8 model homes in total, and the first 3, aside from having the lights and appliances on, were clear, and the doors were even locked, which made it even stranger. In the 4th house, though, as they were checking the kitchen area, there was a click, and all the lights in the house suddenly went out. It wasn't a power cut. The other house's lights were still on, nor was it a breaker issue, as all the appliances still had power. Nothing in the breaker board had been tripped. The lights just shut off. No logical reason why. This put a shiver into both men. They considered some kind of electrical fault, as a minute later, without another click, the lights were back on. Both laughed off their fears. Knowing the homes were newly built and had starter issues, they continued to think in this way, right up until they noticed the lights in the next house were out, and instead the TV was on. Exchanging a worried glance and thinking something was strange, definitely something going on, they headed over to the next house. When they arrived, the lights came back on. But the TV was on standby mode, something only possible by touching the dashboard on the console. There was no sign of anyone being in the house, and nothing else was touched. More than that, they hadn't even seen anyone leave the house on their way over, which theoretically they should have, right? The guard and the officer were becoming more and more unnerved, and in the darkness, it was all too easy to start seeing things moving in the corners of your eyes. The guard switched off the lights in the house and secured it, moving on to the next 2. Where there were not any incidents, the 2 men began to feel a little better until they reached the last house. After turning out all of the lights, they were just about to leave when they both heard a series of clicks from upstairs, like someone was running through the house, flicking the light switches. They both ran upstairs, the officer with his gun drawn to find all the lights upstairs back on again. Feeling a chill under their skin, they searched the entire upstairs again, but found no trace of anyone there. The guard went around again and turned off all the lights, except one on a dimmer in the hallway. As he reached it, the light began to dim on its own, and then brighten again. Both men, absolutely terrified, backed away from the light as it steadily brightened and dimmed, brightened and dimmed, brightened and dimmed, and suddenly just snapped off. The officer and the guard decided to get out of there. They ran downstairs, turned off all of the remaining lights, and locked the door. As they were leaving, the officer thought he saw a shape moving out of the corner of his eye, yet when he turned, he was knocked down by something he could only later describe as a heavy black shape. The officer was a big man, over 250 pounds, so it would have taken a big thing to knock him down. He went to the ground. The guard described seeing a black shape hit the officer, and when it landed, It took the form of a skunk. It didn't stop changing. He watched in horror as it kept shifting shapes and colors from dogs like a Doberman, a bloodhound, a tan mastiff, and then finally settling on a golden lab before running away into the night. The guard also said the number of feet he heard running did not match the number of feet he saw. Both officer and security guard have no explanation for what happened that night, and neither of them would ever go back to that estate again. The Code 5150 is what Californian police use to identify calls with psychiatric issues, the ones that possibly need hospitalization, but sometimes they can be much more disturbing. An officer was responding to a 5150 call at a residence on the outskirts of town. The details of the call were a bit sketchy. The dispatcher said a woman thought her son might be having some kind of drug-induced psychotic break or something. The officer arrived at a typical suburban house in the middle of a run-down, though not really troublesome neighborhood. The officer was on his guard, as these types of calls could mean real danger. Approaching the house, he was greeted by a panicked woman in her 50s, who told him there was something wrong with her 20-year-old son. Upon asking for more details, she said he'd taken some kind of drugs, and he was also refusing to go into his room because, quote, an old man was hanging in there. She tried to get him to explain, but that was all he would say, over and over again. An old man is hanging in there. She was too scared to go in and check on him because her son often brought over his friends who were drug addicts, and they frightened her. One of them could have hung himself in her son's room. She had dealt with her son before in similar states, strung out on all kinds of drugs, and knew he didn't always know where or even who he was. Despite that, her love for her son made her want to make sure everything was okay and nothing more serious was going on. She begged the police officer for help. Feeling sorry for the poor woman, but thinking the case seemed pretty open and shut, he decided to speak to the son to see what was going on. The young man was clearly high on some kind of stimulant. His pupils were dilated, his breathing was fast, and he was sweating profusely. It took the officer several attempts to get him to respond to his question, as the son kept looking through him rather than at him, as though he saw something else where the officer was standing. When he finally did get a response, though, the young man distantly said a spirit had told him that her father, dressed in his military uniform, and hung himself in the room. Skeptical but also unsettled by the son's certainty when he described the spirit, the officer decided to radio for some assistance. If they really did have an unaliving, he really didn't want to be dealing with it on his own. He'd questioned the son again to see if it wasn't just some drug trip going bad, but the story came out the same, and he shouldn't go into the room. It would upset the spirit's grandfather if he were disturbed. The officer then described hearing a strange thump in the next room, loud enough to send goosebumps crawling up his arms. His radio announced backup was on the way, but would be another 5 minutes. Wanting to deal with the sound as quickly as possible, the officer, despite the young man's protests, pushed the door to the room open. But he found nothing. Not a body, not a corpse, not an old man, nothing. Except the room of a 20-year-old young man with band posters, an unmade bed, and an ashtray full of something other than cigarette butts. Shaking his head at the youth, the officer headed back downstairs to tell the young man's mother what he thought of the situation. Just as he was in the middle of describing the situation and telling her there was nothing to worry about, the senior officer arrived, interrupting him. The officer pulled him to one side, gravely serious. Upon asking what was going on, the senior officer said, in hushed tones, when he was new on the force, he had to investigate the unaliving of an older man who had hung himself in the same room occupied by the son. Feeling a shiver go up his spine again, the officer laughed it off, thinking it was a joke of some kind. He was new on the force, and knew the older guys liked to play games with the newbies. The older officer told him he wasn't joking, and he could look it up for himself. They both explained to the mother there was nothing wrong except for the aforementioned drugs her son had taken, and the officers left, with nothing more for them to do. The story of the hangman sat with the younger officer, though, and a couple of days later, he went into the case archives to investigate it. After some researching, he found what he was looking for. Some years beforehand, there was an unaliving of an elderly World War II veteran at that address. Before he unalived himself, he dressed in his army uniform to do it. His daughter found him later, and she'd never been the same since. She also committed unaliving a few years later in the very same house. This story takes place over a decade ago, on a freezing night in the city with thick frost on the ground and snow coming. This usually meant a quiet patrol night because whether a criminal or not, no one wanted to be out in the cold. At around 3 a.m., the dispatch controller got a call from a frantic man who was barely able to talk from fright. Upon being asked what the problem was, he responded by screaming his sister was possessed and had tried to cut his heart out while he slept. He said he managed to fight her off, then run to the bathroom and locked himself in, terrified of her. The dispatcher immediately sent police to his address, put the officers through to the man so they could better ascertain the situation as well. The lead officer was a no-nonsense type. He didn't have time for a hoax, no time for prank calls, so he got straight to business, trying to find out exactly what the situation was. "There's a demon in my sister's body," the man whispered on the phone, quiet as though he was trying not to be overheard. "I'm sorry, sir, a what?" asked the officer, not sure he had heard him correctly. "A demon that has been battling me for days. It got free from the chains." As he was saying this, the officers could hear some kind of scratching and banging at the door. In his report afterwards, the officer said what he heard next sent shivers through him. He overheard another voice taunting the caller in another language through the door. As he or she banged continually on it, he described it as a low and guttural sound, so deep he could hear it rattling things in the bathroom. The voice was saying things that made the officer feel dread, even though he didn't know what was being said. The officer stayed on the line with the caller as he and his fellow officers arrived and quickly broke down the door to the house. Inside, they were met with something that would later give them all nightmares. At the bathroom door was a young woman, thin and gaunt. When her brother had said she'd broken out of her chains, he was not lying. There was a thick chain attached to a bloody handcuff on one of her wrists that clanked every time she moved. Her body was covered in awful scratches that looked self-inflicted, and one of her eyes had popped a blood vessel, which turned her socket an angry red. Her clothes were torn, and she was pale. The officers described her as looking like a corpse. The door was dented and scratched like a wild animal had attacked it. There were huge gouges where her fingernails dug in as she tried to get her brother. Upon seeing the officers, she gave a horrifying scream and tried to attack them. Despite there being 4 male officers there, they had to fight her. The woman scratched and bit ferociously, struggling against them and screaming the whole time. They eventually managed to get her subdued, and they took her to a psych ward, where she apparently remains to this day. The brother, when they managed to convince him to come out of the bathroom, showed the damage she had done to him. His chest was a mass of scratches. He was covered in blood. His sister had actually tried to dig his heart right out of his chest with her bare hands. Many of the officers involved in that incident reported finding their own religion after witnessing it. So after those stories, I think I will be disturbed for weeks. The big question still remains: do we believe these law enforcement officers, or are we still skeptical? You tell me in the comments below. Do you think these stories are legit? I'm still debating. That's why I need to know what your thoughts are, so I can make a decision myself. Alright, that is it for today's videos. Do you like videos in this style? I enjoyed reading all of these reports. I could definitely do more in a different variety, so feel free to share your thoughts. Thanks for stopping by the channel today. I'd love it if you stayed and clicked on one of these videos popping up right now. I will see you there.